Welcome to the Gold Coast North Anglican Church podcast. We're a vibrant church on the Gold Coast in Queensland, Australia. Our worship styles are traditional through to modern, and we have families through to seniors. Our mission is to spread the good news of Jesus Christ throughout Australia and the rest of the world, and to encourage everyone who encounters us to reach their potential in Jesus Christ.
A friend of mine recently sent me a job for an Anglican priest. He sort of said, "Hey, check this out." And so it was fascinating what they were looking for in a priest to lead their parish. They said the ideal priest will preach exactly 10 minutes, but give a full explanation of every single verse in the passage. They will condemn sin, but actually never hurt anyone's feelings. They will work from 8 a.m. till midnight and also serve as the church cleaner and groundsman. They will make the usual stipend, wear the finest robes and clothes, but donate 3/4 of the stipend back to the church. They will be about 30 years old, but have at least 40 years experience. And they're going to make 15 pastoral house calls a day, but always be in their office ready to answer the phone and respond to email. It's an oldie but a goodie, that one. But I think it just highlights, sometimes what can happen if you get caught between unreasonable expectations. And sometimes, I'm sure maybe you've been there, where you seem to have conflicting expectations. Maybe it's at work and you've got different supervisors or bosses or colleagues sort of giving you mixed messages on how to do your job, and maybe it's at home and sort of you try to juggle all the different expectations and you can't seem to win. I guess these days you'd sort of tune into any news service or look at social media, and there's all sorts of expectations about how one ought to live and what's right and what's wrong, and it can be quite challenging. And I think sometimes when all those expectations and those mixed messages really hit you, you can actually get to a point where you start to get quite discouraged. You start to lose hope because it's hard to see your way through. It's hard to see the bigger picture and what you're called to do and be. The Apostle Paul in our passage today faces a similar challenge. He's writing to the church in Corinth, the church he founded, and yet a whole bunch of things have blown up. And when he's tried to correct them and teach them and coach them, they sort of have a go and say, well, actually, no, you can't talk to us. And then they start to contradict themselves as they criticise Paul. And Paul does his genius. He cuts through and he reminds them of the vision of the gospel, a vision for hope. And so we're in week 2 of our sermon series, Vision for Hope. And the big idea really comes out of Proverbs 29, verse 18, and particularly the King James version of translation is particularly helpful. It says, where there is no vision, the people perish. Where there's no vision, the people perish. And I think as a church family, we really experienced that last year as COVID hit. It really kind of knocked us around, but we kind of got some clarity that maybe the vision is just to get through this. And by God's grace, we did. And we're looking, God willing, to be in good shape for the year ahead. And I'm really hopeful that we might have a vision for hope for the year ahead, a vision for hope in your own life, and a vision for hope for our church, and a vision of hope for our world. And so today, in our passage, we're reminded of having a vision centered on the gospel, the good news of Jesus. And so let's dive in and see what our passage would speak to us today. And so Paul, as I mentioned earlier, he's writing to the church in Corinth, and they're having a go at him. He's got these different expectations. And so he's trying to correct and coach some things going on in the church at Corinth. And they then kind of come back at him, and it's really frustrating for Paul, because on the one hand they sort of turn around and say, well, you're not really an apostle, and so we don't have to listen to you. And in fact, more than that, we don't have to pay you. The culture of the church at the time was those who had preached and served in a church were entitled to some financial support so they could keep doing that ministry and encourage the church, perhaps where they're receiving support from, but also so they could support other churches or start new churches. And so there was this culture of financially supporting people like Paul as they sought to do the work of sharing the good news of Jesus. And so in one sense they're saying, well, you can't talk to us, Paul, you can't correct us and coach us, because we've decided you're not really an apostle and you're not entitled to any money. But then they turn around and sort of seem to be saying, the way you read the text, that actually one of the reasons we don't think you're an apostle is because you're not taking money from us. You seem to be financially supporting yourself. And Paul, we learned, was a tent maker, and he would often find work to support himself so he could preach the gospel free of charge. And so they turn around and say, well, you're not a real apostle, we don't want to pay you. And the reason you're not an apostle is because we're not paying you, because you're doing this work on the side to fund the preaching of the gospel. And so a real apostle would actually receive money and not waive their right to money. Can you see the contradiction? Can you see how frustrating that is? I'm sure maybe you've experienced kind of arguments like that, or you've witnessed them where just, it's like, well you're contradicting yourself. And it's just so frustrating. And what Paul does is brilliant. He just cuts through and he reminds the Corinthians it's about the gospel. And it's about preaching the gospel and doing whatever it takes to preach the gospel. And so the first point is when it comes to a vision of hope for our church and a vision of hope for yourself, it's about proclaiming the gospel. And so Paul says, if I proclaim the gospel, this gives me no grounds for boasting, for an obligation is laid on me, and woe betide me if I do not proclaim the gospel. Paul has a passion for letting people know about Jesus. And so in our own lives, we need to receive the gospel. And so have you received the forgiveness that Jesus offers you for your sin? Have you received the assurance of life eternal? Have you received the power that breaks the effective sin of other people's sin on your life? And know the freedom and joy that comes with it. If you can receive that gospel, that good news, it gives us a vision for hope and reminds us no matter what we're facing, we are loved. God is for us. We are forgiven. We are free. And sin has no power or hold over us anymore. And so those things we've struggled with, yeah, we might stumble, but they have no power. And God will help us become all that He actually made us to be. And so we need to receive the gospel, to proclaim the gospel, but then we need to be a people who proclaim it, who share this good news of Jesus. And so at Gold Coast North we talk about helping people know Jesus so they can follow Him and then reach their potential in Him. And so we try to do that through our worship services. We try to encourage people to grow in faith and in the gospel in our small groups. We're looking to do a few other things throughout the course of the year to encourage faith and so encourage this reception of the gospel, the preaching of the gospel, and the living of the gospel. And so Paul says, you know what? You can have your arguments, Corinthians, but actually at the end of the day, it's all about the gospel. It's all about Jesus and sharing about Him. And then Paul goes on to say that we need to fund the proclaiming of the gospel. We need to fund the proclaiming of the gospel. So we need to make it all about proclaiming Jesus, shining the light on Him, raising Him up. But then we've got to fund it. We've got to, as a church, fund the work of the gospel. And so Paul says, for if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I'm entrusted with the commission. What is my reward? Just this, that in my proclamation I may make the gospel free of charge so as not to make full use of my rights in the gospel. And so he's sort of saying, look, I'm happy to work to fund the preaching of the gospel if that's what it takes, that I can give it away freely. But if you guys can fund it and invest in it so I can give it away freely, fantastic. I just want you to know that I'm genuine. I'm not doing this for money. And I guess, unfortunately, there is a history within Christianity of people popping up that it seems to be not so much about Jesus, but about wealth and the person trying to get money, as it were, for doing the God work. And And Paul's saying, you know what? It's not about that. It's about Jesus. And I'm genuine. And look, you can give me no money. I don't care. As long as I can preach Jesus, I'll support myself. But if you support me, great, because I can still preach Jesus. And so as a church, we've got to fund the proclaiming of the gospel. And so I just do want to take a moment to say a massive thank you for the ways in which I know that happens here, and the way in which you invest in the work of sharing, funding the work to share Jesus. By God's grace and your faithfulness and obedience in worshipping God with your wealth and investing in the work of the gospel, we've managed to get through 2020 as a church. And we're working hard to steward the giving, and we've got a finance committee in our church that's chaired by one of our church members, and so they work hard, that finance committee, on budgets and cash flow projections. We've got a great treasurer now. She's finishing up, Laurelie, and we've got a new treasurer, but there's been a lot of transition and training because, again, we want to make sure that we're tracking the money well. We've got Pam, who does the invoicing. And then we've got a great team of counters, and we've got procedures around that to make sure everything's done well. And so we work really hard to steward what you worship with, what you give to God, as you worship with your wealth. And so we're thankful for the ways in which you fund the work of the gospel. And I'm quite hopeful for the year ahead. As a church, we're learning to cut our cloth so that we might be a one-priest parish. Traditionally, we've been a two-priest parish. And with COVID, we've had to become a one-priest parish. So again, part of the way in which you're helping fund the gospel is by supporting this one-priest model. And so I know some of you who are watching online church, they also attend on site. And so I'm just so thankful the ways in which people have been able to accept that, you know what, hey, we can worship God through morning prayer without communion. I know how significant communion is for so many people in our community. But hey, it's okay. We can still worship and praise God and hear from God and pray and be the church together through morning prayer. We can have John preaching on the screen, and that's okay because we're hearing God's word broken open. So I'm just so thankful for your support in that way, for the support of our retired priests and deacons, for the work of the LAs who actually are leading morning prayer and so forth. So that's made a big difference. One of the ways we're looking to fund the preaching of the gospel is we're creating a vision account for each church. We've got an overdraft that we're working on paying off this year. We've still got a loan for the church that we built at St. Matthew's, and we'll be looking to get stuck into that hopefully next year as we currently just service that through the interest payments. But really looking forward to letting you know that we've created these vision accounts, and we're doing a bit of a soft launch with them, and so the idea is each church has an account to help fund the vision for what's next for their church. St. James, St. Matthew's and Holy Rood. Now, we haven't created an online one, but look, please mention in the comments or send me an email if you think having an account for the online church would be helpful, that you might, as an online member of our community, hey, you'd love to give some money to help upgrade the equipment and help us strengthen our online ministry. So please do let us know. But the idea is that funds, the funds that are generated, will help us take the next step at each church, whether it's something to do with equipment, whether it's something to do with staffing. And once we reach the amount of money that these things cost, we can then take the next step. And so the invitation is to either give a one-off gift. You might give a one-off gift, or maybe a one-off annual gift each year, or you might be able to give something over and above your usual giving to support the work of reaching the vision in each church. And so we've got to proclaim the gospel, make it all about the gospel, and we've got to fund the proclaiming of the gospel so that we can get on and we've got the resources needed to be able to share Jesus. Paul then continues, and he reminds us that we need to be flexible in how we proclaim the gospel. Many of us grew up in kind of traditional Anglican worship, or maybe you've come from another denomination and are used to the more traditional patterns. But the challenge for us is actually, how do we preach Jesus to different, subcultures in Australia, you might say. Paul talks about that, he became a Jew to be able to preach to the Jews. He became someone under the law to be able to reach those under the law with Jesus. He became as one not under the law, even though he himself was under the law of Christ, so he could reach those not under the law, the Gentiles. He also says, you know what, to the weak he became weak. He became all things to all people so he could preach Jesus. He accepted that he needed to be flexible, and I think sometimes we're a bit kind of locked in how we seek to express the gospel and how we seek to worship God and present ourselves as a church. And so what I love about the Anglican space is that we can be quite flexible. I really enjoy being able to go from traditional and perhaps a high kind of culture of expression of church through a more relaxed and informal and contemporary expression between our different services. And so if we're going to reach the generations who aren't here, and that's a big challenge for us as a church, we need to be able to be flexible in how we preach the gospel. And we need to be able to fund and create different spaces for young people, young adults, people just below us. We need to be creative through online church and so on. Lots of different things are needed. And so I really want to encourage you to have a degree of flexibility in your thinking. We're always going to try and maintain different kinds of spaces, but love for you to be praying and supporting different expressions that we might reach more people for Jesus. Finally, Paul says that he is blessed in all that he does for the sake of the gospel. That as he does it, he shares in the blessings. And so hopefully you have received the blessings of the gospel yourself. As you've received that forgiveness, you know the joy it is. But then as you participate in the work of helping people know and follow Jesus, you will be blessed. And we saw in the interviews last week at our different church services on site, we interviewed people about their experience of being part of a small group and of serving. And they all just said they were blessed, that as they got involved in a small group, as they led a small group, as they started serving in the church, whether it was as a welcomer in the kitchens, cleaning, reading, saying prayers, whatever it was, kids ministry, they were blessed. That as they participated in this gospel work, they felt so blessed by God. And so I just want to encourage you to have a vision of hope that's centered on the gospel for your own life, that each day you might awake and arise and know that you are loved, forgiven and free. And with God there is hope. And I'd love to encourage you to partner with us and see yourself as someone who is investing and funding this work of the gospel through your giving. And I'd love for you to encourage you to if you worship in one particular church and you service and style and you see a different one, you think, oh, that's not for me. I want you to be someone who looks and goes, hey, that's not for me, but I'm going to pray for it and bless it so that way people who aren't like me can get to know Jesus and be part of the journey in our church family. That's one of the reasons I'm sort of not a big fan of knocking other denominations, because we need a variety of expressions of church to be able to reach the multitude of people that exist. And so let's be blessed as we do this gospel work together. Let's as we do it, have our vision for hope lifted, that we can have an amazing year in Jesus' name. All right, go well. God bless.
Thanks for joining us for the Gold Coast North Anglican Church podcast. I invite you to like us, follow us, subscribe to our podcast so that way you don't miss out on any episodes. If you want to know more about Gold Coast North Anglican Church, then head over to our website. The address is goldcoastnorth.org.au, and there you can find out all about our church. I also encourage you to engage with us on Facebook. We would love to pray with you and connect with you. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. God bless.